Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. You've seen this quote everywhere. On posters and self-help books, on the Instagram pages of people who've read exactly one chapter of history, and it's always credited to Winston Churchill. But there's one small issue. He never said it. But the world doesn't seem to care. Churchill has become that rare historical figure whose name gets slapped onto anything that sounds bold, dramatic, or vaguely British. If a sentence has enough grit and enough cigar smoke in it, people just assume it must be his. And that alone, as a standby fact, says a lot. No other politician of the 20th century has a global following quite like Churchill. Not Roosevelt, not de Gaulle, not even Stalin, or any other politician from World War II, despite the occasional admirer with a concerning sense of nostalgia. Bookstores around the world are stacked with his biographies. Towering piles in every language, the biographies of most other historical figures are far less known than those of the legendary British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Now, let's conduct a short experiment. Ever heard of this before? Churchill drank and smoked consistently, yet somehow lived past the age of 90. He considered democracy an imperfect form of government, but still a lesser evil than every other alternative. He negotiated with Stalin and supported the Soviet Union in World War II, despite his most feral anti-communism. He delivered two famous speeches. The first, the anti-Hitler speech that opens an Iron Maiden track.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island.
And the second, at Fulton, near the start of the Cold War.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
He even found his way into songs. Iron Maiden's Aces High, the Beatles' Revolution 9, Pink Floyd's The Post-War Dream. Churchill appears often enough to qualify himself for royalties. Many people who aren't even interested in history know at least these fragments of Churchill's biography. Where does this exactly come from? Well, partly, it's obvious. In Britain, he has long been recognized as the most popular public figure of all time. But why do people around the world quote him so often? Why do so many AI bots imitate his style? Winston seems to attract myths the way a lighthouse attracts ships, and occasionally wreckage. This is how all those quotes appeared that he never actually said, and the glorification of Churchill shows no sign of slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating. There is no point in retelling his life story step by step. In this video, I will explain why Churchill became the brightest symbol of world politics, a symbol of Great Britain who managed to eclipse even Queen Elizabeth II herself, and why so much of the international audience has built a real cult around Churchill as one of the main luminaries of recently driven political thought. Welcome to Double Agent, a channel revealing the truths they don't want you to know, or maybe just forgot to mention. People really like to follow those who break the rules. Not the criminals, but the ones who treat society's expectations like polite suggestions. We're drawn to people whose behavior steps outside the accepted, or especially when their status is far higher than our own. Churchill's lifestyle, his almost theatrical disregard for sobriety, is the perfect place to begin. Picture him in your mind for a moment. You probably see an older, round-faced man with a cigar permanently attached, wearing either a sly half-smile or a kind of grim British seriousness that looks carved from cold marble. That is how most photographers present him, and the most famous of them all, the roaring lion, was taken under very characteristic circumstances. In 1941, Churchill arrived in Canada after delivering a speech in the House of Commons in Ottawa. As he stepped out, a persistent photographer swarmed him. Churchill, already irritated and with only 2 minutes left to spare, lit a cigar as a kind of protective barrier. Cigars had been a part of his life since youth. After all, no one served in Cuba and returned without developing a taste for good tobacco and equally good alcohol. The photographer, however, decided the cigar ruined his shot. Abandoning every rule of etiquette, he marched straight up to Churchill and plucked the cigar from his mouth. And in that instant, he captured the expression. Half fury, half wounded dignity. That became a wartime icon. That glare would later be interpreted as the distilled symbol of British defiance in World War II. The Allies were not simply resisting, they were prepared to go all the way to victory. Why did I even start talking about this photograph? Because the way we imagine Churchill's face tells us which period of his life we consider alive, relevant, and worth remembering. We don't picture him during his early military service, even though he already had a distinguished record of war, adventure, and even captivity. We don't imagine the young member of parliament or the lord of the admiralty. We barely remember his role in the disaster at Gallipoli during World War I. All of these fragments fade behind what came later, the part of his story he clawed back from the edge of failure. And the cigar only strengthens that image. Since we've already touched on his bad habits, we can't ignore the story of alcohol. Churchill really did love to drink, and one tragicomic incident illustrates this perfectly. In 1931, while visiting New York City, he was hit by a car. The reason? A very British mistake. He forgot that Americans drive on the opposite side of the road, stepped into traffic, and was promptly run over. He suffered multiple fractures and landed in the hospital. But here's the detail that became legendary. One of the doctor's prescriptions stated something along the lines of, "I hereby certify that the Honorable Winston Churchill requires the regular consumption of alcoholic beverages, especially during meals, for medical recovery." But what is definitely a myth, however, is the story of his supposed love for Armenian cognac and Paul Roger champagne. There's a popular tale that at the Yalta Conference, he enjoyed Soviet cognac so much that Stalin ordered it delivered to him for the rest of his life. As for the champagne, Churchill enjoyed it. Yes, but he enjoyed it like a statesman enjoys a long lunch that someone else is paying for. Paul Roger became his favorite house, mostly because they treated him with the reverence usually reserved for minor royalty. By the end of the war, he was drinking it often enough that the association stuck. Beautiful stories, but both fall apart the moment you look for evidence. But Churchill wasn't an alcoholic. He knew his limits. No one ever saw him passed out, slurring or staggering through a party. Churchill depended on alcohol, yes, but he was never its slave. But who did Churchill depend on most during the war? Strangely enough, Stalin. Winston's attitude towards the USSR had always been harsh. The belief that Churchill wanted to strangle the Bolshevik state in its cradle is not a myth at all. He hated the communists and openly supported the White movement during the Russian Civil War. Churchill even called the Whites "my army," which was a dramatic exaggeration, but entirely in line with his personality. When Denikin's forces were approaching Moscow in 1919, Churchill even planned to fly to liberated Russia and help draft the constitution. That fantasy didn't survive contact with reality. What did survive was the Soviet stereotype of Churchill as a warmonger. For years, the British, far more than the Americans or Germans, were portrayed as the main enemies of the Soviet state. But over time, this hostility softened. By 1933, Churchill had a new enemy number one. The communists faded into the background, and the Nazis became, in his eyes, a mortal threat to Britain. He sensed the risk of a new war long before most of his colleagues did. Throughout the 1930s, he was in opposition to Britain's policy of appeasement, and as soon as it collapsed, he stepped into the spotlight. Churchill would become not just a symbol of war, but the international symbol of resistance, a man who would fight Nazism to the bitter end. But this part requires some honesty. Churchill was a brutal racist. His years in India left him with a fierce contempt for Indians. When famine swept the Indian colonies in the 1940s, he refused to help, essentially abandoning millions to die. He even told the Secretary of State for India that he hated Indians and viewed them as a beastly people with a beastly religion. Yet despite this eugenic arrogance, Churchill despised the Nazis' racial worldview even more. And when the moment came to fight Hitler with bullets, he accepted help from anyone, from Indians to Malays, from white sons of the Albion to the millions living across Britain's empire. Churchill had political instincts closer to an animal's survival reflex than a philosopher's doctrine. He constantly adapted, constantly shifted, constantly evolved. But one thing never changed: his desire to protect the British Empire. And nothing demonstrates this better than his most iconic wartime line. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Britain needed allies desperately, and Churchill found one in the very regime he once vowed to destroy. Some call this hypocrisy, but in Churchill's worldview, survival came before ideology. When the homeland was in danger, he was perfectly willing to swallow every belief he had ever preached. Under his leadership, Britain swiftly organized Lend-Lease, the supply of weapons and equipment to the USSR. Many think of Lend-Lease as an American project alone, but that's not entirely accurate. The northern convoys, packed with tanks, trucks, aircraft, and raw materials, sailed from British ports through deadly waters to reach Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Soviet pilots and tankers fought in British-made machines, and these were not free gifts. The USSR received them on credit, at extremely favorable terms. Stalin himself, in a speech on May 1, 1944, admitted that the Soviet Union's success was made possible largely by its allies, the United States and Great Britain, who held the front in Italy, North Africa, and forced Germany to split its military resources while inflicting devastating blows on its industry from long-range Anglo-American bombing campaigns. And that contribution, in no small part, was Churchill's doing. The leaders of the USA, the USSR, and Britain knew each other far more personally than most people imagine. Churchill, in particular, made a habit of flying across oceans and continents to galvanize the war effort, most famously crossing the Atlantic to rally the Americans, charm Congress, and remind Roosevelt that Britain was not planning to die politely for anyone's convenience. And from earlier academic days, many people may remember the three grand meetings of the Allied leaders: Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, where Truman replaced Roosevelt. But Churchill and Stalin met once more, before all of that in 1942. And reaching Moscow was a nightmare, even by wartime standards. The entire sky above Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. Churchill had to fly in the back of a Liberator bomber, completely unheated, rattling like an iron coffin, with no space for a proper bed. Instead, there was a narrow shelf where he lay in the dark, in the freezing air. A far cry from the aristocratic comfort he had grown used to. To make matters worse, the rear of the aircraft wasn't airtight, so he needed an oxygen mask. And because Churchill simply refused to live without cigars, the crew found him a special mask that allowed him to smoke in midair, at high altitude, while wearing oxygen. It was the most British solution imaginable. The bomber's route was absurdly long. After heading toward the Atlantic, It made a huge detour around France, reaching Gibraltar after 7 hours. From there, it crossed neutral Morocco and Vichy-controlled Algeria, flying to Cairo, another 10 hours. Then, on to Tehran, another 7, and finally from the jointly occupied capital of Iran, the last 10-hour jump to Moscow. In total, Churchill landed at Khodinka Field after 34 hours in the air. He was 67. This was not a pleasant journey for anyone, let alone a man who had already lived through cavalry charges and political scandals. And yet somehow, he still had another 23 years ahead of him. Churchill arrived with a mission. He wanted to reassure Stalin about Allied intentions and soften the blow that the Second Front would not open in 1942. Banquets became the diplomatic battleground. Around long tables, during endless toasts and heavy Soviet feasts, the two old politicians found their most surprising moments of mutual understanding. Eyewitnesses recalled that everyone looked cheerful, almost like guests at a wedding, despite the fact that victory was nowhere in sight. Churchill's talent for persuasion had always been his strongest weapon. He had enemies, critics, and rivals, but even they admitted the effectiveness of his charisma. Vyacheslav Molotov, who had made a similar journey to London earlier, wrote that Churchill, the same man who 2 decades earlier had demanded the Bolsheviks be crushed, was now in Tehran and Yalta, declaring that he prayed for Stalin's health. And at that moment, such eloquence worked entirely to Britain's advantage. The Potsdam Conference would be the last time Stalin and Churchill sat at the same table. And during it, something extraordinary happened. Before us stands that very Churchill, the roaring lion, the defender of Britain, the man who outlasted Hitler, seized the helm of the empire at its darkest hour and dragged it towards survival. And now, this same Churchill is losing an election in his own country. It seems almost unbelievable. How can the man who won the war lose the peace? It all comes down to parties. The Conservative Party, led by Churchill, rested on its laurels. It offered no serious program for the post-war years. No plan, no vision, no roadmap. Meanwhile, their opponents, the Labour Party, worked relentlessly. They talked about rebuilding the country, dealing with the staggering national debt, restoring the economy, reintegrating millions of returning soldiers into civilian life. There were hundreds of thousands of them already drifting home, and Labour spoke directly to their future. Churchill, by contrast, offered nothing except criticism. He attacked Labour's plan and went so far as to claim it would create a new Gestapo in Britain. This moment reveals something crucial about British political thinking. Even if you're a hero, even if you have saved the nation, none of that exempts you from competition. You still have to earn power the same way everyone else does. And past merits will not come to your rescue. The British were exhausted by war. Churchill was the prime minister of that very war. And outside the war, it was as if nothing else remained behind him. He became a hostage to his own image as the savior. When a long, difficult, tedious restoration is required, it is not saviors who are needed, but people willing to roll up their sleeves and actually rebuild. As soon as the war ended, Churchill's main political purpose seemed to evaporate for a moment. The fight against the Nazis was over. The USSR was extending its influence deep into Europe, and so it was time to return to the old, reliable pastime of anti-communism. Churchill came to America. He had already agreed with President Truman on the text of the famous Fulton speech, and there, standing in a small college gym, he essentially declared the Cold War. But few people remember Stalin's official response. It appeared in Pravda on March 14, 1946. Stalin directly accused Churchill and the entire West of behaving no differently than Hitler. According to Stalin, The idea of a superior German race had simply been replaced by a superior Anglo-Saxon one. He accused the West of totalitarianism, insisting that countries in the Soviet bloc were governed not by one party, but by coalitions. Proof, he claimed, of genuine democracy and the absence of any repression. Churchill always saw the USSR as a threat, and when the Soviet army ended up in the very heart of Europe, literally Berlin, the sense of danger only grew. It was under these conditions that new military plans appeared. The first was offensive, supported by the United States, with the hope that the Poles could be lured into rising against the Soviet rear. But this plan quickly became absurd. The balance of power, combined with the popularity of communist parties in Europe, made it impossible. So a second plan was drafted, with a far more ominous title, The Unthinkable. According to it, if the USSR attacked, British forces would fold up and retreat as fast as possible. Britain was preparing for another 1940, another desperate defense of the island. Churchill himself, commenting on the plan, called it a preliminary sketch of what I hope is still a purely hypothetical probability. And that is exactly what it remained: hypothetical. But the Second World War had already drawn a thick line through the British Empire. Colonies were peeling away. The crown, once biding, was losing gems by the year. In 1947, India declared independence. For Churchill, an old imperialist who shed more ink than blood for the empire, it was a haunting, almost personal tragedy. Stripped of power, retired, and aging, Churchill was given one last turn at the wheel. 6 years later, he returned to the Prime Minister's chair, but he was only the shadow of the man who had defied Hitler. Churchill was aging, and the empire was aging away on his watch. Britain, like a tired, elderly widow, now leaned heavily on the strength of her younger daughter, who had long moved out. America. Churchill believed Britain's salvation lay there. But he never finished his term. In 1954, at the age of 81, he resigned for health reasons. His speech was slurred, his hearing weak, his sleep short, his cigars still endless. His famously unhealthy lifestyle finally demanded repayment. Yes, he once joked that he owed his longevity to sport because he never practiced any. But that wasn't entirely true. Churchill had been around horses all his life. He was an experienced polo player, rider, and when he got the chance, he enjoyed the swim too. Hardly the portrait of a man morally opposed to physical activity. Still, no hobby could save his star-black lungs or his exhausted heart. In 1965, after yet another stroke, Churchill's life came to an end. Britain froze. All events were cancelled. Despite the bitter cold, hundreds of thousands lined the streets to say their goodbyes. Volunteers handed out hot soup, tea, sandwiches. This scene looked like the warriors all over again. The very war Churchill had won. And after his death, the man gave way to the myth. The interpretation became more important than the biography. And over time, Winston's image transformed yet again. What do people think of Churchill now in his own country? Churchill is still recognized as the most influential Briton in history for almost every reason imaginable. Few can offer any competition. Maybe John Lennon, Queen Elizabeth, or Princess Diana. On the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, a survey was conducted in the UK, asking who inspired you most as a narrator. Despite the anniversary, King took second place, decisively losing to Winston Churchill. The British still recognized their Prime Minister's mastery of speech. It was largely thanks to his eloquence that the country united during its darkest hour, not just internally, but with its allies abroad, and won the war. His wartime speeches became a symbol of resistance. But in recent years, amid the broader wave of the fight against racism, Churchill's image has soared across the West. His statue is regularly vandalized, and British society now debates whether Churchill should remain a national hero or whether he deserves cancellation, placing not victory in war, but the oppression of colonial subjects at the center of the conversation. If the older generation still reveres Sir Winston, younger Britons are almost evenly split. Interestingly, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson rushed to defend Churchill. Johnson tried to shape himself in Churchill's image, his behavior, his rhetoric, even the messy hero persona. But anyone who remembers that era probably wouldn't call the imitation successful. Liz Truss invoked Churchill's resolve. Rishi Sunak praised his wartime leadership. Keir Starmer framed Churchill as complicated but essential. And yet, in today's Britain, some people go as far as to claim Churchill never existed at all. According to a 2008 survey, nearly a quarter of respondents believe Churchill was a fictional character. What's so funny about that? Most of these same respondents were absolutely convinced Sherlock Holmes was real. We've sorted out Britain. Churchill is already an ambiguous figure. He remains popular because he became the symbol of saving the country and the world from Nazism. He was vivid, flawed, and never hid it. That made him human, and he became a template for future politicians, a masterful orator whose speeches inspired and rallied Britain. Everything is clear with the British, but why does the world still care so much about Winston? Churchill fits perfectly into the stereotype of the Englishman. Prim, aristocratic, slightly bulldog-like, yet noble and patriotic. But above all, in the eyes of many, even internationally, he is more than just a portrait in a cigar lounge. He is the very war itself. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. That is what the triumvirate of victory in the deadliest war in human history looks like in global memory. Every year, we read books, watch films, revisit the Second World War, and there he is again. A bright, sharp politician who never held back his words. Few abroad call him a hero, but Churchill's entire career passed through hard historical storms, and he became their very voice.